Well, hello, everyone. Hope you're having a pleasant Tuesday afternoon. My name is Ella Woger. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Invest Puerto Rico, which is the entity charged with the attraction of new business to the island. So it really is my pleasure to welcome you all to this important virtual roundtable in which Invest Puerto Rico, along with folks, from various sectors and varying experiences, will highlight what the island has to offer in the growing remote work environment, which, as you all know, has become increasingly relevant, particularly during the past 6 months of this year. And we're proud to feature a distinguished group of panelists who will share their insights on working in Puerto Rico, how to maximize the available resources, and really more than anything else, from a personal point of view, how life has been since their move. Now, before we begin, I would like to point out that we are very eager to address all of your questions. We received those submitted by many of you upon registration of the event and have included those on the Q&A session at the end. Now, to those who submit your questions during the course of the event, we'll be sure to answer via email after the event has concluded. Now, to send your questions, please use a chat box located on the right side panel of the meeting screen. Now, let's go on to Roderick Miller, who's the CEO of Invest Puerto Rico. But before he begins, let's just show a little teaser of what working in Puerto Rico looks like.
What comes to mind when you think about Puerto Rico? In the midst of this tropical paradise is a growing, always evolving people, ever-strengthening infrastructure, and booming business ecosystem. Puerto Rico is the warmest, most beautiful, and varied location you can give your business partners and employees. Come take a closer look at Puerto Rico, then tell everyone you know.
Now, isn't that a beautiful setting to live and work? Bienvenidos a Puerto Rico, la isla del encanto. Welcome to Puerto Rico, the island of enchantment. Thank you, Ella, and thank you all for joining us today. As the island's economic development public-private partnership, at Invest Puerto Rico, we have made it a priority to leverage Puerto Rico's strengths, especially in the current climate of COVID-19, in which many are realizing the ease and ability to work remotely from anywhere and are eager to leave major metropolitan areas across the continental U.S. The goal of this event is to showcase the remote worker value proposition that Puerto Rico has to offer, including a high quality of life, strong community networks, both professional and around personal interest, strong information communications technology infrastructure and shared workspaces, and attractive tax incentives and benefits for relocating to the island. Now, we are honored to have with us today a distinguished panel of speakers who will share with us the experience of what it's like to work and live in Puerto Rico. Please welcome Samantha McGue, Client Experience Manager at Hire Me, a cloud-based recruiting platform that assists businesses in interviewing, hiring, and onboarding staff. Samantha has over 10 years of experience working across people operations in a variety of startups. And then Matt Kirk, founder of Spes Co-working Space. Matt is a serial entrepreneur, and in 2016, he created Space, Puerto Rico's premier workspace solution for successful business people. And now a big hola for Kurt Pfluger, co-founder of Saletis Capital, a corporate advisory firm based in San Juan. He brings to the table C-level experience in blockchain investment, software, and technology. Let's also welcome Giovanni Mendez. He is the managing partner at Geotax. Giovanni has extensive experience as advisory counsel for investors and businesses establishing on the island, setting up their corporations, tax preparation, and incentives qualifications, amongst others. Thank you all for joining us today. Now let's start with the fun part. There is a quality of life like no other in Puerto Rico. My first week living in Puerto Rico, it was February of 2019, and I arrived to nice warm temperatures in the 80s. Coming from Atlanta and previously Detroit, it felt amazing to wake up each morning, sit on my balcony, and listen to the sea. And even with the occasional rain, it's really always nice outside. We know food in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico offers some of the best culinary experiences and the most eclectic restaurant scene in the Caribbean. And while some think of Puerto Rico as a tropical escape, and it certainly can be, life here fits all kinds of personalities. You can choose to live on the high rise by the beach in Condado or a shack by the beach in Isabela. There's also the country life in the mountains of Rio Grande and Ciales, or suburban abodes in Guaynabo or Humacao. All of this is available for a fraction of the real estate cost of major US cities. Puerto Rico offers activities for everybody, from surfing and kayaking to golfing in one of over 30 courses throughout the islands, or hiking miles of trails in our rainforests. And then there's the life of leisure at Plaza Las Americas, the Mall of San Juan, and hundreds of shopping centers. And I could go on and on and on and on and on about the good life here. But now let's get down to the remote work business. Remote work was inevitable. Prior to the onset of the pandemic in March, 43% of US employees were already doing it in some capacity. And this number has really grown over 44% over the past 5 years. So where and how does Puerto Rico figure in all of this? Well, for us, the situation, the current situation, the COVID situation, accelerates ushering in the fourth industrial revolution, namely the maximization of infrastructure projects that ensure information communication technology stability and internet access across the island. To this end, businesses, government entities, and organizations of all varieties are implementing new technologies that enable them to continue working through this health scare, through this health pandemic. Remote working really relies on video conferencing, high-tech web platform to connect with clients and provide services and track relationships, and high-speed connections to access, share, and react to information from anywhere, anytime. As such, companies and individuals in Puerto Rico are already benefiting from the high-speed internet, 5G rollouts, and LTE service from a variety of top-tier providers. T-Mobile, for instance, rolled out 600 megahertz across the entire island. In 2019, the FCC allocated $500 million over 10 years for fixed broadband support and $250 million over 3 years for mobile broadband support. And Old San Juan offers public Wi-Fi thanks to the local supplier Aeronet and Facebook's cutting edge Telegraph. There are more than 3.17 million internet subscribers in Puerto Rico. 29% have speeds of higher than 100 megabytes per second. On the real estate side, also, it's relatively lower commercial and residential real estate costs in Puerto Rico that make the island a fairly attractive place. It's an attractive place to start and scale business, an attractive place to attract and retain talent, particularly low and middle level positions with unorthodox flexible work arrangements. All of this is reinforced by the even lower relative real estate costs outside of Puerto Rico's metropolitan areas. So why is Invest Puerto Rico promoting remote working? Well, research shows that remote workers support and diversify the local economy, buy and rent homes, and improve local skills. They also drive innovation and demand for better tools, faster internet, and more comfortable public workspaces like libraries and cafes. Puerto Rico has room for growth in all of these areas, and remote workers would play an important role in further developing the local ecosystem. There are also generous incentives to start a business, hire and retain full-time employees, and perform research and development designed for those that source their income from Puerto Rico. Giovanni will speak more to the available incentives which are suited for remote work. As with any move, adapting to a new place is best when you engage with the community, and here you will find groups and entities to fit varied interests and lifestyles. Facebook groups where newcomers mingle with locals and discuss everything from schools and restaurants to businesses and investment opportunities. There are religious communities across all denominations. There are special interest groups in sports, environment, innovation, family, LGBTQ issues, just to name a few. In short, coming down to Puerto Rico is just like moving to any other state. You'll find your tribe and you can grow from there. At Invest Puerto Rico, we are aggressively championing remote working because remote workers will positively contribute to our economy through consumption, elevating the local workforce realities, and helping to strengthen our business climate. Our vision in this venture is clear. Embed remote work in talent attraction initiatives to create a community of workers. This community acts as a midway point for targeting the companies that they work for, especially if their companies recognize that their remote employees are benefiting from the high quality of life and opportunities to work and grow in Puerto Rico. Of course, I can go on and on about this, But the best way to make the case for Puerto Rico as a world-class remote work hub is to hear from people who are actually doing it. With this, I'll pass it back to Ella to begin today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. Thank you for really kicking off this virtual discussion and talking about the why Puerto Rico is such a good location for remote working. Now, I really want to turn to our wonderful panelists here. We have a great group of panelists today, which Rod introduced earlier. And I'd like to start with Samantha, who, as Rod mentioned, is a client experience manager at Hire Me, which is a cloud-based recruiting platform. So Samantha, it really is a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. I want to start with you. Could you, tell us a bit about your background and your pathway to becoming a remote worker?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Ella, for having me and the rest of the Invest PR team. As Rod mentioned, yes, I've worked in HR and talent acquisition for the past 10 years, primarily focused in tech-based startup environments, but most recently 100% remote. And at Hire Me, we've always worked as a fully distributed team, even pre-COVID times, with most of our employees across North America and both Canada and the US. So we didn't have to adjust much given the past 6 months. But I've also consulted for several companies who pre-COVID were also ahead of the game in realizing that the competition, especially for technical talent in certain areas, such as the Silicon Valley, was becoming impossible to compete with. So looking outside of that, being a fully remote team for me was a huge incentive to join the company I'm currently with. And I know the same goes for a lot of my colleagues.
And so you mentioned you've lived in several places, right? Like this is before landing here in Puerto Rico. What makes Puerto Rico different? Why Puerto Rico? Because given that you've had experiences kind of working remote in several other locations, would love to hear your perspective of what makes Puerto Rico different.
Yes, absolutely. I actually grew up in Minnesota, so quite the opposite from the island. But my husband is from here. And upon starting a family, we decided to relocate back here for the support. Aside from that, we were able to really weigh the differences between living in San Francisco and the Bay Area, California, one of the most expensive places in the country. Spent about 10 years out there. And our migration from there went to Colorado for a couple of years before deciding to make the move here. And so, of course, there are obvious perks, sun, sand, we have rainforest adventures at our door, but we primarily came to raise our family here. We have quite a bit of support, and so we sold our small home in Denver and traded up for a house by the beach, our favorite beach with a mountain biking trail. We're fully set up with a backup generator, water cistern, limited backyard landscaping Pinterest board ideas coming to life. But we also came because of the slower pace, and the culture here is very important and dear to us. After working for a decade in high growth startups and graduating out of our 20s, we were seeking a calmer environment where we could still work hard, but avoid burnout due to external factors of work-life balance. So I was pretty happy to give up the 2 hours of commuting across the Golden Gate Bridge to be able to trade it for this.
Yeah, sounds like a great idea to me. And could you talk to me a bit about, what does a day in the life of a remote worker like yourself look like in Puerto Rico?
Sure, absolutely. And granted, we are a tech-based company, so we're pretty tech savvy. We were already set up with our systems.
Sure.
But we wake up every morning, have a nice cup of our locally sourced Alto Grande coffee. I get to have breakfast with my kiddo, and then I head into my home office here. Our team stays connected through apps such as Slack for live chat, Zoom, obviously, for meetings, and some good old-fashioned phone calls. we're able to be pretty flexible throughout our day, and we have a pretty transparent communication across our team. So sometimes I'm able to start my day pretty early so I can make time to go to the beach during the weekdays after work when the popular locations aren't as crowded. But day to day looks pretty much the same pre-COVID and now for me personally. But I do have quite a bit more flexibility, not having to commute and having a full setup here.
Yeah, that's certainly what it sounds like. It sounds like you've been able to achieve just a quality of life and a work-life balance, if you will, with this remote working environment. I know that the community is really important when you are remote working. You want to feel that you're part of a community. Could you talk to me a bit about the community of other remote workers that you found here?
Sure, absolutely. When I initially came, that's one of the first things I started looking for. We don't have WeWork here locally on the island, but I did a quick search and I was able to come across actually one of our other panelists, Matt, has put together an incredible space called Space, and it's located in Santurce, and it is an incredible physical space to work in. One of the main reasons I was seeking that as well was for the solid internet connection and to make sure that I didn't have any disconnect, considering that I work solely from a computer. So that was one thing I was seeking, just being an individual worker as well, some sense of community. And so based upon the folks that I was able to interact with there, that really put it on the map in terms of, me being able to establish myself as a digital nomad on my own. But since then, I've migrated out and moved about 30 minutes away from the city in another one of the hubs of communities in Dorado. We're just 30 minutes west of San Juan. But another couple of ones that we did look and evaluate outside of the Metro San Juan area were also Palmas del Mar, down in the southeast region, and then also across all the way on the west coast, Rincon. It was a little too far for us from our family in San Juan, but we did consider it as well. And there's a lot of Facebook groups, there's a lot of WhatsApp groups, and they all are very open to share their resources and finds. But I also find myself networking through there as well pretty often. And you can ask and search for questions, anything like the best internet providers to use, everyone's take on different neighborhoods and towns, recommendations, but also just, especially through these times, a support system to just ask, how are you handling these situations these days?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. If there's one thing about Puerto Rico as an island, it's not, we're talking about 35 by 100 square miles, yet there are different communities and it's not just concentrated in the metro area, right? You mentioned more in the southwest part of the island. You mentioned the west coast, which is surfer town. And so you really have a really good mix, depending on what you want. You can really find a community that best adapts, to your own lifestyle. So, and the great thing is, it's a small geographic location. So you can be out on the West Coast in a couple hours. It's not, it's not relatively not far, right? Compared to
right.
right,
so, exactly.
Yeah, so it's great that that we have that proximity, if you will, and that folks can really take advantage of different types of lifestyles, if you will. And you mentioned, the co-working space, and you mentioned Matt, and we're going to speak to him in a bit. But before we do, I do want to ask you something in particular. So you are, you work in people operations, right? And I was wondering, what trends are you noticing in companies establishing remote work policies, and what are remote workers looking for in a company?
Right. So I would say that the job boards are shifting quite a bit in how they're advertising. For example, there probably hasn't been so much activity so far until now on a job board like remote.co, which fully pulls all jobs across the board, all industries, any type of hiring, but fully remote positions. That's just kind of the guarantee.
Sure.
to get on that job board. So, one like that is it's interesting to see that now folks are starting to prioritize that, especially those who have been stuck in major metro areas, living in a small apartment, paying top dollar for their real estate, are questioning what
Yeah.
do I want to stay here? Yeah, definitely across the board, a lot of the networks I work with are having pretty big conversations about how this is disrupting the HR side of hiring. What happens to things such as payroll when we have people working as digital nomads? They need to pick an address, but based on that, do we benchmark salaries around that? How do we adjust their benefits package? Do we allow them to go overseas? These are definitely big questions that I would say it depends on your leadership stance on where they see the company growing in the future. But Puerto Rico is essentially a spot where if you run a small, lean team, the possibilities are pretty endless here. It's pretty incredible. The things you can take advantage of here, the cost of living. For me, it was the perfect setup personally, but I would definitely encourage anyone to explore the opportunity to, put down some roots here as well, with the ability to be fully supported working remote.
Thank you, Samantha. You mentioned, thank you for providing that perspective. You mentioned that having a good space to work with, right, is important, and that sense of community as a remote worker. And I want to use that actually to transition to talk to Matt. To Matt Kirk, who created the workplace environment that you used, which is called SPES. And so I want to transition now to Matt to ask him about a couple questions about that sort of workplace environment. Matt,
Hey, Ella.
Matt, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Long time no see.
I like your office.
I wonder why. For the benefit, we actually are in this co-working, this environment that Matt created here, and I would, love, Matt, for you to speak to, your impetus behind creating SPES, and how the remote worker environment in Puerto Rico really factored into your business plan of creating this sort of co-working space. Could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting time when I came down here with my family nearly 5 years ago, and myself being pretty much a remote worker at that time, wanted to really have an office that fit my needs because personally I can't work from home. It's very difficult for me to do that. So I need to be more focused and have an office. And to do that, much like what Samantha said, I called around to different places, and unfortunately, there was one that really called me back, and that was the easiest one to decide on at that time. And I knew once I landed in that office that I didn't want to continue doing the same thing I had been doing for the last approximately 12 years or so. And I had had some experience with being a client at WeWorks of the world and Regis's of the world, and decided that I didn't see really a fit for what I thought would be a good model in San Juan. And that's, offering a space that is designed for a remote worker, offering a space that is unique in the sense that it's not just co-working, but it's a place that people can go and connect. Yes, we do have a community, but also we have very premium services that go along for our clientele. So with that opportunity, we went into a design phase and started looking at what the market would bear, where a great location was, and we think we landed on it. We think we have a great product.
And what does the remote worker community look like in Puerto Rico from your vantage point?
From us, we see so many different kinds of remote workers here. We have, for instance, a great example is we have an individual that comes down seasonally, and she represents a firm that does logistics and reservations for fractional shared jet programs. So hers is unique because one, she only uses Puerto Rico on a seasonal basis, but she also uses her hours of operation are pretty much midnight to 5 a.m. So she needed a place that she could, one that would be safe, two that would have the ability to have reliable internet and electric connection, and so she basically camps here during the seasonal side. From a transplant that's coming down here and a permanent remote worker, we see all kinds. We have exercise fitness gurus that do it online, that do personal training online, to just independent sales reps that are here.
And you mentioned, earlier the the importance of community, right? And the importance of having a sense of community when you're remote working. What does SPES do to drive that sense of community?
We probably, unlike some, we take a little bit different of approach with our community here. We value our members and their companies' privacy tremendously. With that, we don't actively force community. We kind of let our community evolve.
Mhm.
And I mean that by saying that we definitely will promote it if we see advantages for the two parties, to meet and interact together. Uh, but we really don't take an active approach on forcing the model to for the individuals to kind of join a community. We feel that from events that we do, everything from a cocktail hours, happy hours, to lunches and other events, we want to give them the experience with that, but we don't really force it on any of the members.
Sure,
So
it's
it's go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah, it's more organic, if you will. It
It,
evolves, from the proximity and just, working together and seeing each other every day. You develop those relationships with other folks
absolutely,
in the
absolutely.
office. Yeah. And I know, you have this is a very particular kind of model. I know in Puerto Rico there are other co-working spaces. I think that's the very cool thing about Puerto Rico. Just like you have different kinds of communities, being in the West Coast, in the North Coast, you also have different types of co-working spaces. Some you have SPES, and you have others that cater more, perhaps to the younger, the younger community. You have Piloto. There are many other co-working spaces. It just depends, what the appetite you have, and the lifestyle, right, and the work lifestyle that you have. But there's something here for everyone in that regard. And you yourself came, you came. What have you noticed, like the difference between living here and living in the States?
Wow, yeah. There's a lot of differences. Rod in the beginning pointed out so many great things about the island, and I would encourage anybody that's looking at doing a move to come down here and really spend some time. Be open-minded in the sense that understand that this is not going to be where you came from. My family and I came from a wonderful community that was a great place to raise kids, but it was very homogenized, and we wanted to have more of a diverse cultural experience and understand that that wasn't going to happen from where we were located. So it's, to come down here and, I'll be honest, you're going to be frustrated with some things, but you you can't change it. And once you decide, or once you understand that, that's the world becomes a lot easier. And this is a tremendous place to, immerse yourself in the culture, to be a part of the growing community from an entrepreneur standpoint. It's a fantastic place for food and entertainment experiences, and the people here are amazing. So what you will experience from what is not the norm where you're located, I think you're going to make it up and be very happy with the experience that you'll receive here.
Thanks for that perspective, Matt. I think, Puerto Rico really, does have a lot to offer, in that regard. And I know that SPES not only host remote workers, but, also host companies, if you will.
Sure.
And one of the companies that you host is Solaris Capital, which is a corporate advisory firm based out of San Juan. And so here with us today, we have Kurt Kluger, who is the co-founder, managing partner of the firm, and would want to transition to Kurt. Hi, Kurt. How you doing?
Hello, Ella. Yeah, great. Thank you.
So Kurt, I'd love to pick your brain a little bit now. And if you could just tell us a bit about your professional background and how you got to Puerto Rico, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I spent almost 20 years in Silicon Valley. So I was a tech entrepreneur and started my career there. I started several companies there, and then became an investor and an advisor. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I were looking at it because we thought it was the right time for us to make a move. And so we looked at Puerto Rico, and we came down for about 10 days and decided that this would be a great transition for us because of all of the not only the incentives, but just the lifestyle that the island offered. And so that was kind of the impetus for us coming to Puerto Rico.
And talking about that lifestyle, how has your experience been here versus Silicon Valley?
Well, I get to surf with no wetsuit, so that's
It's always
really
good.
of Northern California. So I love that. Yeah, I'm about a 5-minute walk to the beach and to hit the waves. So that's been a really nice benefit. But on top of that, just professionally, I think there's just there's a lot happening here. It kind of reminds me a lot of the kind of the early days in Silicon Valley where it was all about the possibilities, and I see that here in Puerto Rico. There's an energy here. There's a willingness on the part of the people in the community here to try to make good things happen, and I think that's been a great draw here for and a great it's a great thing to have on the island as it helps kind of promote a lot of innovation and things that can be good for both companies professionally and also just personally to see that kind of activity here.
You mentioned, all these opportunities that have come up, and oftentimes, I feel remote working is kind of tied to the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And Invest Puerto Rico is actually going to have a whole separate webinar on innovation entrepreneurship here on the island. But as a teaser, and because you're so close to it, what does the entrepreneurial community in Puerto Rico look like from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm the direct product of that community because I came down here to start my own company, and after arriving, I met some other folks that had recently relocated down here. We formed Solaris Capital, so we formed this company just by networking and meeting one another down here. And today, our company's about a year and a half into its infancy. And with we've been able to achieve great things. We've got about 250 million of assets under management, and all of that happened here in Puerto Rico.
And you established that company in Puerto Rico, but you've also found opportunities. This is a nod to something that you said earlier. You also found opportunities to give back and invest in further developing the landscape for innovation here. And so, I'm aware that you've been working with local and external partners to establish like a 5G zone that will allow for creating and testing new technologies. How do you see opportunities such as this benefiting remote workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just so many things. I think that because there's this community of folks that have come and self-selected to be here, as well as the community that existed before we arrived here. And I think just that spirit of collaboration and the opportunity to kind of make this a better place, to try to add value here. It's not just to come here and accept the incentives and kind of go about your way. It's to really become a part of the community, and part of being part of the community is to also to contribute to that community. So that's part of what we're doing with the 5G zone, and I know other folks have many other things happening there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I consistently see when I speak to investors. They come here for something in particular, and then they just encounter different types of opportunities, and they go into the the ecosystem, and just things come out of this, and you start forging relationships, and forging just new opportunities in general that were not the original thing that you came to do here, right? And so it starts kind of sprawling into exciting, other exciting things. um, I know, Kurt, that your company employs staff that oftentimes remote work, especially during these times, right? How has that changed, during COVID, and what, if anything, has that meant from a productivity standpoint of your staff?
Well, in some ways, I guess the rest of the world caught up with us because
Yeah.
we were in Puerto Rico and working kind of remotely anyway, and video conferences were, aside from travel here and there, I mean, video conferences were kind of the way that we operated our business, and so now everyone's doing that. So I think for anybody that's working remote, the great thing about being in Puerto Rico, and I think during COVID, we felt very grateful to be here, to be able to have the ability to not only work here, but then also enjoy everything the island has to offer in terms of mostly nature, because a lot of things, like in other places around the country, things were not necessarily open fully. So, but just the ability to get out in nature is, and I think it's a great benefit here.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Um, you mentioned at the beginning, when you're talking about your professional background and why you came to Puerto Rico, you mentioned incentives, right? And so we know that Puerto Rico does offer a very competitive incentive landscape, and which is why we have Giovanni here, actually, to talk a bit about that, because it's something that you said at the very beginning. It was, we came here, partly because of the incentives, but then once you come and you realize, what a rich, culture this is, and everything that Puerto Rico has to offer, it, becomes something else. But the reality is that, the folks that come here can benefit from a competitive incentive landscape. So I wanted to unpack that a bit with Giovanni Mendez. Thank you, Kurt, for providing your perspective. I want to turn now to Giovanni, from GeoTax, who can give a bit more color on the benefits and tax incentives that could potentially apply to remote workers. Hi, Giovanni. How are you? Thank you for.
Hi, Ella. I'm great. I'm great. Thank you for having me.
So Giovanni, Puerto Rico recently enacted, the Puerto Rico Incentives Code, also known as Act 60, which is essentially just a tool designed to accelerate economic growth, through investment, innovation, export, job creation. What element of Act 60 could apply to remote workers?
So I mean, the one that is most obvious is the export services portion of Act 60, because it's specifically designed, whether it's in a smaller or greater scale, for work that is performed from Puerto Rico to the world, to clients outside of Puerto Rico, whether they're in the mainland US or basically anywhere else. So it's the direct and most obvious incentive. And obviously, the benefit is that the income that is sourced to Puerto Rico under those services is taxed at a 4% rate for the businesses that are established here in Puerto Rico. And then there is no additional tax on the distributions to the owner. So there's no double taxation. It's only 4% tax, and no tax on those dividends or distributions.
And Giovanni, thank you for that. Aside from these incentives, what other benefits, tax benefits, could you speak to for anyone that works from Puerto Rico?
Yeah, well, when we think about remote work, there's, you don't always need to have a client. For example, the individual investor portion, if you're a day trader sitting from your house and, you're working the markets or whatnot, you could do that as an individual investor. So that's another incentive. There are additional incentives for things like research and development, film industries, and creative industries. all things that you can do remotely. For example, in the creative industries portion, I've had clients that do post-production for film. That's something that, again, you can do from a Mac computer, from your home, or the concept of export services, remote work in general, right? Whether it's in a space like you are in right now, right? And it's not necessarily just working from home, but it's having a remote hub that's not a traditional office. And all of these things can be done from Puerto Rico. I mentioned post-production, there's actually a large film studio being created right now. So there's going to be more space for beyond your traditional office doing that from here. And then you generate, in addition to the 4% tax rate that I mentioned earlier, industries like research and development or film industries also give you the ability to generate tax credits, which are up to 50% of your expenses locally, and which can be sold in the Puerto Rico market. So it's a way for startups to get cash flow back. There's a lot of expenses for startups or for independent projects. Well, through tax credits, you can get part of that expense back. And there's a very good market for selling those tax credits locally.
Yeah, Act 60 is definitely, it's an all-encompassing code. And I'm sure, Giovanni, I mean, you've spoken just about Act 60. You can speak for hours and hours. And I know you have. I've collaborated with you before, and I've seen you, because there are really so many different types of incentives that could apply for working, but also, for companies that are trying to get the most out of their tax structures, right? And so it's something that is really worth exploring, from a tax standpoint, how you can benefit from Puerto Rico. And I know you've been in this for a long time. You've been working with companies and individuals, coming to Puerto Rico for years. What can you tell us about their experiences and how they've evolved, in their businesses and personal ventures, exploring new opportunities? Because I'm sure you've seen a lot, and how it's evolved over time.
To that point, at the beginning, I was going to say, I feel bad. I think I'm the only one that is not working from space or doesn't have a relationship with space. But actually, I do remember when space was created. So I've seen that evolve, and I've seen industries like space maybe take a risk a few years down the road and be a success, definitely, because you see all the new businesses coming in and all the new types of business ventures come in. So I've seen a lot of, whether it's deal flow, whether it's people connecting here, or I've seen a lot of success in finding talent locally. And also I've seen opportunities. There's a lot of things that come through my desk that are very interesting. And I eventually see people that are clients separately all of a sudden working together, or even myself potentially being involved in some sort of projects, because it's definitely, Puerto Rico's also always been culturally rich, but now from a business standpoint and from a knowledge base and knowledge transfer standpoint as well, that's definitely my personal experience. I'm Puerto Rico, not born, but almost born and bred. I've pretty much been, I was raised here and went to school here always. And I've been able to interact with so many new industries or different industries through these programs. So whether it's the booming blockchain industry or tech industry in general, these acts serve their purpose. Obviously, we want to bring in capital. We want to create those jobs. But the knowledge transfer also permeates to local businesses. So that's something that to me is absolutely brilliant. The infrastructure in Puerto Rico is definitely a lot better than anywhere else in the Caribbean, right? So, if we look to compete against a major city, then you're going to say, oh, it's difficult. But even in the mainland, there's a lot of places that don't have as near as good cell phone service, high-speed internet, et cetera, than Puerto Rico. And here you kind of have it all, where you cross from one place to another. So that's something that's definitely very interesting. And then from doing business standpoint, if you're thinking about going international, Puerto Rico is definitely the connection to Latin America. It's a connection to many parts of Europe. And on the contrary, if you are in another place of the world and you want to do some nearshoring, I think time zones were mentioned earlier in this webinar. If you're in a completely different time zone and you want to do business with the U.S., Puerto Rico, this is your bridge to the U.S. Another very interesting thing is development of IP. There should be no one developing IP inside the US and continental US because it's going to cost you tax-wise. But if you want the trademark protections from the USPTO without having to pay the tollgate tax, Puerto Rico's your hub. You get federal court protection and federal law protection for all your patents, but you're not penalized by paying high taxes with doing business internationally. So that's something that you really need to think about as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Giovanni. I definitely think that this whole idea, it's part of the broader value proposition of Puerto Rico, the fact that we are under a U.S. jurisdiction, and so that comes with the legal and regulatory framework of the U.S., and that includes intellectual property protection. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's very relevant for the type folks that we're seeing coming to the island. And it's interesting you said that I was born and raised here. I'm Puerto Rican, and I can tell you, and I've lived here and I've lived in the States, and I came back around 2 years ago, and I've just been so it's been an incredible feeling to see the way the entrepreneurial ecosystem here is just flourishing. It's something that it's a very unique opportunity, and we're seeing an influx of a lot of folks that are just doing great things here, and collaborating with the local community to really put together something that's making waves, And so I thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's even I as a participant, I see the difference in the past 4 or 5 years of the way the local entrepreneurial ecosystem is evolving, and that's really tied also to remote working, if you will. But I do want to open it up for broader questions. I actually do want to start with you, Giovanni. Talking about if you have all these folks, welcome to the panelists. Glad to have you all back here for the discussion. But I'd love to ask all of you, what do you think is, why Puerto Rico? Like, at the end of the day, if you're talking to somebody that's considering working remote, what would you say are the key things that they should consider regarding Puerto Rico?
Well, if it's me, I'd say one of the first things is it's human resources. The talent that you have in Puerto Rico and that you have the opportunity to work with in Puerto Rico is great. There's a great knowledge base, and all of that is surrounded by these great tax incentives, right? So it's very attractive tax incentives, and you're not. Once you understand, I get it that it may be different than where you're at right now, but that's always going to be the case. So once you understand Puerto Rico and how it works, and where to find things and to connect with the right people and communities, it was mentioned earlier here. There's Facebook groups. There's a lot of things. So once you understand and have the right resources, you will have the human resource. You will have the technology and infrastructure resource. You're going to be able to get the broadband, the high-speed internet, and the redundancies you may need. If you're a teleradiologist, or if you do telemedicine in general, I've had these clients. I've seen these big, beautiful setups of computers and monitors everywhere that rely on these very high speed connections. You get all this with the addition of being able to live on an island and pay 4% tax. So, perfect.
Thanks, Giovanni. Kurt, what would you answer to that same question?
Well, I think Giovanni hit on the key points there. I mean, you're in the U.S. You have incredible incentives here and a lifestyle that you can't match. I mean, the art, culture, music that exists in Puerto Rico is second to none. And I think there's so many choices where you can go live in the world. But if you're a U.S. citizen, there's no better place than Puerto Rico.
And
Well, I'll just chime in quickly on that. I mean, I think there's something
yes,
about
please, Rod.
the quality of life is great, but it's quality of life and it's excitement. It's not exactly the same as living stateside, but it has enough of the amenities of home that that one feels really comfortable here. But there's also a palpable sense of opportunity. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things is that you can feel the opportunity in the air, that Puerto Rico is evolving and it's changing and it's growing. And being a part of that, I think for people who want to be a part of something special, it's a unique moment in time.
Thanks, Rod, for your perspective. You yourself came a couple years ago. You've been on and off coming to Puerto Rico for a while now. So you're like our adopted Puerto Rican here.
Thank you.
Sam, what about you? What would you say?
Yeah, no, I would echo what everybody's been saying. I think that definitely there's more of a network we think, but also it's not actually that far. Even coming from the East Coast, it's a pretty quick flight over. Also, prepare yourself to welcome lots of visitors. You're going to have once we have travel more normalized, people are going to want to come visit you. Definitely prepare yourself by informing yourself. As we've all kind of mentioned, there's lots of resources out there, groups that are sharing information. So just arm yourself with the education and all the questions you have. People are very open to answering them, whether it's their personal experience or just sharing the resource. It's definitely something that you want to do the background research on prior. I think Matt mentioned coming to visit is certainly key. But if you come open-minded, I think that you're going to be very, very happy with the possibility of relocating here.
Samantha, you mentioned resources, right? Could you speak to some of those resources that are available on the island for peer support? I know you mentioned at a high level, but I think it'd be great for our audience to understand at a deeper level what we're talking about when we say these resources, because they really are great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, well, we've all maybe seen the Netflix special Social Dilemma recently, but I will point to social media. Here on the island, Facebook is probably one of the most utilized resources for both businesses and personal networks. But if you go and do a quick search on any Facebook group, I know that there's I'd say I'm part of maybe 3 or 4 different expat groups. A lot of people are coming from the continental US, but also from abroad. And they have questions, especially related to it's anything from how do you bring your car over here? What's the best approach to finding a school? I have kids that are this age and this age. And there's a whole history of discussions on these Facebook groups that are great resources. A lot of the other groups that I'm part of are on WhatsApp. It's an app you can download on your phone, and it's group chats. A lot of those links can be found through Facebook as well. It's just an opportunity for folks to have more specific questions answered. For example, we're part of a family hiking WhatsApp group, and every week we pick a different place to go hiking and share that resource with the whole group if they want to access it later. So there's endless resources that I found there personally that I feel people are sharing really great information on. But just by doing a quick search, you can find anything from agriculture to, again, as I mentioned, family-related networks.
Thanks, Samantha. And I think the good thing about these groups, particularly in social media, is that they connect you also to the local community. And so you can ask folks from the local community things as mundane as some of the things you said, right? To other more comprehensive questions like tax questions. And I know, Giovanni, you're very active in some of these groups. And I know, I've seen you answer it, and it's kind of like real time feedback, if you will. So I think it's it works really well for these folks that are that are here and are on the island and have access to all these resources, real time access to these resources. So I definitely think it's really good to just connect at a local level as well. So I'd love to talk about some of the biggest myths, or perceived challenges about working in Puerto Rico, because some people, think about electricity or connectivity and so on and so forth. And I would love to pose this question, maybe perhaps first to Matt. What would you say are the biggest myths about working in Puerto Rico?
From a personal experience, I can say that some of the myths that I've run into is a lot of people think that it's not connected to the United States. That and unfortunately, some people are surprised when you tell them that everybody here is an American citizen and you don't need a passport, and it's relatively easy to travel down here and you don't go through customs. So I think that's a little bit of a misnomer where people don't understand the simplicity to travel down here and even to move down here. I moved a lot of places in my life, and this, logistically, this wasn't that big of a challenge to come down here to do. So that's, what they probably read in the headlines, especially after Maria with the electricity. Part of our challenge was after Maria that you lost electricity, but it's something that you have to understand where we're located in the world, and that stuff happens, and every place has its challenges. This place, things like electricity it does happen where you lose it, but you overcome and compensate. And most everybody has generators or secondary backups of some sort. So there's
Yeah, actually, Matt, regarding electricity, there was a question that came in precisely about this and about the ongoing efforts to improve the reliability of the Puerto Rico electric grid. I would actually pose that question to Rod. What is Puerto Rico doing to be able to improve this reliability from a power standpoint?
Yeah, this is one of the questions that we're most often asked about. What about power reliability? Well, it's been improving for a while. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, more commonly known as PREPA, is a public corporation of the government of Puerto Rico, and it owns and operates electric generation, transmission, and distribution facilities serving all of Puerto Rico. I guess maybe in June or July, something like that, there was an announcement that was made with a group called Luma Energy to operate, maintain, and modernize the electricity transmission and distribution system for the next 15 years through a private partnership. Our organization has already had some meetings with Luma, and we're confident that there's going to be a quality investment and upgrade in the caliber of service. And it's also important to know, just I think maybe 2 weeks ago, the federal government announced a $13 billion investment in the island, with about 9-10 billion of that going towards the electrical utility and updating the transmission and distribution system, and the rest of it going towards the education system. So one of the things about this particular time in Puerto Rico is that there is a significant commitment, not only on behalf of the island government, but there's also a significant federal investment that's going into making sure that the utilities and the services with Puerto Rico can compete with anywhere in the U.S. or around the world. And so we're really encouraged by that. And I guess the last point that I would add is we're also seeing a lot of private sector innovation come in to actually tackle these challenges, whether it's related to electrical utilities or water, or you name it. And so we've got this interesting kind of fusion going on of private and public, not only investments, but innovations in making Puerto Rico world class.
Thanks for clarifying that, Rod, because I'm sure this is a question that we get asked all the time, in our work here at Invest Puerto Rico. I think, obviously the hurricanes, what happened in 2017, in a way put Puerto Rico on the map. Those who knew Puerto Rico knew about all, the wonderful business environment that we already had. But come the hurricanes, this obviously put Puerto Rico, on the map for some folks. And with that, sometimes you get a lot of negative press, and people think that we're still recovering, and we are. But the silver lining here is that there is so much, so many funds coming in for the reconstruction, and there's just such unique opportunities to be part of that. And I think now more than ever, that social response, people don't just want to invest for the sake of investing, they also want to make a difference. And we find that that's what people, in part are coming here for. I do want to go back to the question about the myths to some of the other folks here, in terms of, what have been some of the surprises, things that you thought about Puerto Rico, and then when you came, you were surprised that it wasn't so. What would you all say about that? Kurt or Sam or?
Well, I think there's a misconception that maybe this is not a safe place, and I have found it to be a very safe place. I mean, never been in a situation anywhere on the island where I felt unsafe, and so I think that's one of the big misconceptions that seems to be out there.
Thanks, Kurt. Sam, any other thoughts on this particular one?
Yeah, I was going to say we just moved out here to Vega Alta, and we've been able to be lucky enough to find a house that was fully suited up for hurricanes. I was obviously very concerned. This was my first season starting to go through it now, but we were able to actually, we're going to hopefully be able to tap into the solar market soon, and start to really do a little bit more of a deep dive into what technology is being used now for solar panels. But we have a system set up here that actually, if for some reason the power goes out, we have a generator that's propane fuel that already kicks in after a couple minutes. We have a water cistern on the roof. I felt very confident in not even knowing sometimes that it switched over. And so that's a question I got quite a bit from my personal network at home. Is it safe? Not just, physically on the streets, but just with the hurricanes coming in and out. And so that was obviously a concern of mine, considering I've never lived in the Caribbean. But I felt that, the resources are available. People are trying to come together to put together the best resources for both home and businesses. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, one question I've had come across in terms of safety.
Yeah, you bring a good point there. I think, no place in the world is exempt from natural, disasters, if you will, from, the fires to tsunamis to earthquakes. But the interesting thing here is that we've been through a lot, and that has just made us all the more resilient. And I think that's something that probably, 15, maybe 20 years ago, we couldn't say, but now it's very much part of our value proposition of Puerto Rico as an investment destination. We are a resilient community, and we've taken all the steps to be able to navigate, when these things come up, because we've experienced a lot of them. And I think, resilience is it's in our DNA. And so that's something that we certainly, have been telling folks and people that have been here on the island. They can attest to that. They can attest to the productivity of the workforce even after these natural disasters. So it's definitely something that is very much part of Puerto Rico's value proposition right now. Kurt, I did, want to ask you, Puerto Rico is often overlooked by Silicon Valley investors, and you were there for many, many years. But with the ability to work from anywhere, more and more startups could relocate, to Puerto Rico if their investors, were supportive. So what is the biggest perhaps misconception among, the investors about the opportunities for startups to excel in Puerto Rico?
Well, I think that I think that the playing field has been even. It's been even in a little bit all around the world, and why not Puerto Rico? I mean, I think that as long as those companies have the fundamentals of the types of characteristics that investors are looking for, there's no reason why Puerto Rican companies cannot be successful from Puerto Rico. And I can tell you, just our firm has single-handedly established 3 different startup companies from Puerto Rico. And as Giovanni mentioned, there's no better place to set up your company, park your IP, and operate from. And particularly if you're a founder, this is the best place to be, because some of those incentives directly benefit you upon an exit. So there's in my mind, there's no better place than Puerto Rico to set up your company if you're a startup. And in terms of attracting investors, I think investors are always looking for great opportunities, and so there's no reason why Puerto Rico isn't on the radar for those investors.
Thank you for that perspective. Kurt, coming from somebody that has come here and has done it, has been successful. And I think you mentioned a couple of things that I know Giovanni wanted to chime in here.
Yeah, a little bit on that, and in general, the thing is, just building on what I mentioned before, what Kurt just said. Our legal framework we have our own legal framework, but it is within the federal law framework, so it's going to be very familiar. And many people maybe, they ask questions about banks, like, but I need to have my money in Puerto Rico. How safe are the banks? They exist within, your federal system. They're FDIC insured. They're registered in FinCEN. All these things exist and operate within the same safe harbors that you have in the U.S. Some other things from a legal perspective, for example, employment law. People continue to say, it's impossible to fire an employee in Puerto Rico. And that's not necessarily true. If you can document that someone is not complying with their job, they're not doing their job correctly, etc., it works just as the same as in the U.S. Obviously, there are protections against discrimination. There are protections, but again, that all these protections stem out of a federal legal framework. So it's understanding that all the framework is born from the same federal framework, maybe understanding what is different, but it's not a place that you're going to be so unfamiliar with, because it's very, very similar to what you'll find, in mainland.
Thank you, Giovanni, for that perspective. Actually had a question come in, which I want to address to you, Giovanni. The question goes like this: what are the tax and other implications for a New York-based firm employee working remotely from Puerto Rico? Are there permanent establishment or other tax issues that make the decision for an employer different than for an employee working remotely from one of the states?
Yes. So again, Puerto Rico operates within the framework of the U.S. The only thing is, there won't necessarily, if it's a W-2 salary, there won't necessarily be a tax benefit for the employer working remotely from here. Act 60 creates a benefit for difficult to recruit employees, but that's for businesses that are operating from here. So we'll see how that evolves as the regulations come out. But what I have seen is employees that become contractors of their companies. They could become consultants or contractors of their companies. Maybe they were at a point of their careers anyway where that was a next step. And they come here, do that, and that way they can take advantage of the incentives, now being their own business, even if they're pretty much, providing a lot of similar services than what they used to be providing. So that's something that you do want to explore. Puerto Rico obviously has its own registration requirements. So at a certain point, the company may need to register as a foreign entity doing business in Puerto Rico, right? But you'd have to meet certain thresholds to do that, and there may be some compliance, some minor compliance. although Puerto Rico is not unfamiliar to expat employees coming here, and basically circling through the island. So there's waivers and exemptions that you can request for many of these things. But again, if it is a possibility to switch to maybe become a contractor, maybe you just hit a jackpot there.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to earmark that, because I think that's really the beauty. You have people that are remote working that, if they do become a contract worker and they do establish their own company, they could benefit from some of these incentives. And the reality is that, as I mentioned before, Act 60, really does offer many, many benefits. And it's an extensive law with very, a lot of nuances that can be further explored, if you will, and could apply to different types, of scenarios. So it's something that is definitely worth looking into. I do want, I have a question here about productivity. Samantha, I'm going to direct this to you. Do you find your company and team to be more productive while working remote? That's one. And number two, how do you overcome the challenges of working remote with clients of different generations?
Okay, yeah, not a problem. So the first one, definitely can speak to that. As I mentioned, we were a fully distributed team from day one. So we didn't have to adapt recently in the past 6 months. We run a very lean team. And so given that, we have a pretty transparent form of communication. We're very open. We have an out of office calendar that we all share. So everybody kind of knows if somebody's going to be out, even if it's just for a doctor's appointment, or if they're going to take the whole day. One thing, culturally with a lot of the tech startups across the world is that, a lot of us have been implementing this unlimited vacation policy. It's, running under the assumption we're all adults, take the time you need, because at the end of the day, statistically speaking, remote workers tend to put in more hours, especially if you're working from home. I don't know if it's this draw to, it's harder to walk away because you're not clocking out at a certain hour to go home and have dinner. You're already here. But we do tend to put in more hours than you maybe realize. And it's important to have that work-life balance, given that freedom to work from a home office or work remotely. So we're definitely coming across that as well, especially given the past 6 months. My challenge has actually been, making sure everyone is taking enough time off, taking the breaks they need to avoid that burnout. So it again depends on your team. I think that the ability to be transparent across leadership and individual contributors, talking more openly about, hey, how pulse check, how are you feeling? Adjusting to working remote. Do you feel you're putting in too many hours? Do you feel you're able to get your to-do list done at the end of the day and walk away from the computer? Or are you coming back at 8 p.m. and drilling out a couple extra hours on a regular basis? I think just check-ins are important to gauge both productivity as well as just a health check on the wellness of your team adapting. And then the other question, of course, was overcoming the challenges of working remote with clients of different generations. I think that with Hire Me, that's something that we focus on a lot, is practicing the patience and empathy with our customer base. We work with several operators in the restaurant industry, and as you all know, that's been a severe challenge these past 6 months with ebbs and flows of hiring needs changing. Technology is a constantly revolving door of change anyways, and updates. So really it's coming with the perspective of knowing that we're all sitting on a learning curve here. So I think that practicing that empathy at the end of the day is the most important. And my role in client experience is actually to focus on where that disconnect lies, so we can fix it, with the goal being to enable self-service for any customer from any background to be able to use the technology well. Technology can be intuitive given the right foundational setup, of being given the right set of tools, but speaking from, Let's see. Sorry, can you guys hear me? I think I disconnected there. Okay. But I think that, that's for us at least, it's been extremely beneficial to invest in a really solid client experience support team, to be able to have the human side of technology still exist.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I actually want to ask Rod this question. I mean, we ourselves, Invest Puerto Rico has transitioned to a remote work, environment. How have you seen, what has this meant for the productivity from your standpoint?
You know, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, and actually, I would agree with with much of what Samantha shared, which is, I don't think we've seen a drop in productivity at all. If anything, we probably have a higher level of productivity, but it's different. And I think I actually think it adds to the quality of life. We are in a work environment where we expect results. We have a very important mission in terms of driving jobs and investment to the economy of Puerto Rico, and our employees take that seriously. But we also want a work environment where people can cultivate and develop themselves and their families. And so one of the things that we've seen, if people need to take, a break in the middle of the day to take their kids to something, or many people have children and they're figuring out how to navigate that kind of stuff from home. The remote working environment allows for people to be responsible and actually drive their productivity while providing what they need to provide for their families. And I think that's a tremendous benefit to remote working. And from an organizational perspective, with the level and caliber of employees that we have, I would argue that in many cases, people are much more cognizant of the reality, because they don't see you every day, that there is a need to perform and demonstrate their value. So I think people go out of their way to show you how diligent they are and responsible they are in their work in a remote work environment, in a way that they may not even do it when they're in the office every day. So it's been good for Invest Puerto Rico.
Thanks, Rod. And, I'll be the first to attest to that. It's interesting. I think this is, in a way, almost increased a bit our productivity as an organization. But I definitely think, what we're looking at is, and what we're seeing is, these hybrid, allowing, the flexibility and have some sort of hybrid model where you allow the flexibility to the staff to come in when they want to, but also give that flexibility to work from home, when needed. Anybody else have anything to say on the productivity question? If not, I have a question here about transportation, actually, more about the quality of life. So can you speak to the mobility on the island? How, safe is public transportation? Do many people bike or drive? Do folks drive mopeds? Anybody want to tackle that one? Giovanni.
They started putting these, the birds all around. They're here. So they parked two in front of my condo in Adoré, and I've been using that for a few times to come to the office. So, just driving as an electric scooter, it's about 15 minutes from Adoré to Santurce. So it's a lot of fun to do that one. But transportation in general, public transportation, I don't think it's something that many people moving here would use. It's not so common, but we do have Ubers and taxis, and now, and there are people. I think people bike more for sport or for exercise. The roads are getting a lot better. I'm a bit of a petrol head in general, so I just like to drive mostly. But I think the whole new, I don't know if it's a hipster type of transportation. I'm taking on that, very well. So it is possible, but roads are, I would say, mostly safe in general. I get asked that a lot. And safety, like was mentioned, I think earlier, safety is a lot better than what people expect.
I would just chime in there. I think it's a mixed bag. I do know, I'm part of numerous communities here in Puerto Rico, and I actually know several people who, get around on their bikes, and they are pretty aggressive about riding their bike from one area to the other. I also think public transportation varies widely depending on what part of the island that someone is in. But from a biking perspective, there are a lot of great, for those that just like the trails and stuff. There are a lot of great bike paths, and I mean there Parque Lineal, which is a park that goes here all the way from where I live out in Guaynabo all the way to Dorados. So from one side, 30, 40, 50-minute bike ride. So there are great biking paths, and it's a great way to get around. The thing though that I think I have to mention is how cheap Uber is here. When I first moved to Puerto Rico, I didn't have a car for probably the first 4 or 5 months while I was waiting for my car to get here. And I took Uber everywhere. And by and large, most Uber rides were less than $5. And so that was one of the things that I found was a very easy way to get around. And I did take the bus a few times, but that wasn't a primary form of transportation that I took. The Ubers were pretty reliable, and like I said, super, super inexpensive. It was cheap.
Yeah, I've got to say this whole transportation, it's changed a lot, but I think it's also changed not just in Puerto Rico, but at a global level. I mean, Uber really just transformed the way that we transport, ourselves. I could tell you that Puerto Rico was everybody had a car here. Before it used to be that people, had a car and they would drive and they would use this to go on road trips and whatnot. And more, you're seeing that people are not necessarily just reliant on the car, but they just use Uber to go to places because it's just more efficient and it's just easier, if you will. But they're also, it depends also on the community where you live. If you live in the metro area and in some parts of San Juan, you can really walk to places. I remember Rod, when he first moved, he lived it was a 5-minute walk from the office, right? And so there are certain areas in San Juan where it's just a walkable, a walkable city, if you will. And it depends where you are, on the island. And there are the scooters at Giovanni. It's funny because you see them everywhere now. Like I was out this weekend and everywhere. I mean, I must have seen seriously around 20 people on those those electric scooters, if you will. They're everywhere now. So and of course COVID has also changed the way that we're doing things, and so you see a lot of people more just using bikes and using these electric scooters to transport themselves everywhere. So I think they're, the bottom line, they're just options for everyone, here. And it just depends, where you're going, where you are. But there really are, options for everyone here. I think I'm looking here at the questions. I think we have time for maybe one more question. More about infrastructure. Would my AT&T phone coverage work here? It absolutely would. I have it. And I think this is, do FHA programs extend to Puerto Rico as well? Is this something that somebody, Giovanni, I don't know if you want to address this?
As in for mortgages, if that's the question, then yes.
Yeah.
And they apply. We have different, I mean, it depends on the type of loan. We have different rural zones. Actually, most of Puerto Rico is rural, so you'll probably get more coverage on these types of mortgages or other benefit programs than you would in other places in the U.S. You'd be surprised on what's considered rural here.
Thank you, Giovanni. But yes, absolutely. The FHA does apply here as well. I think we are out of time for questions. I think there might be a couple more, but we can answer them, by email. We have the information. Thank you so much to this wonderful group of panelists that have chimed in here during this lovely afternoon. Really appreciate, your remarks and your perspective. And with that, I do want to pass it on to Rod for some closing remarks, if you will.
On behalf of everyone at Invest Puerto Rico, I want to thank our speakers and you, our viewers, for listening in on this discussion and sharing your thoughts. Before we sign off, I encourage you to visit our website at www.investpr.org. That's www.investpr.org to learn more about our organization and Puerto Rico as a business and investment destination. If you own or lead a business and are interested in finding out more about the benefits available to businesses for relocating on the island or establishing outposts for remote workforce, our business development team is here to help you. Reach out to us. Here are some of our leadership contacts. We are eager to show you the way to moving to Puerto Rico. Whether you're an experienced digital nomad looking for a place close to home for a remote working experience, or a recent remote worker in light of the pandemic and corporate policy changes, Puerto Rico offers the experience and the place. Come and join us. Gracias a todos. Thanks, everyone.